All right. Well, we'll begin promptly. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session in the foster care webinar series titled Best Practices for Supporting LGBTQ plus students with experience in foster care. My name is Ben Simmons. I am a youth development specialist at the Center for Schools and Communities working on education stability for children and youth in foster care in Pennsylvania. And I will be moderating today's webinar. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize that tomorrow is Human Rights Day, a significant occasion that commemorates the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This document is a global pledge to uphold dignity, freedom, and equality for all. As we reflect on that progress and the work that still lies ahead, today's webinar is particularly timely. We'll focus today on ensuring LGBTQ plus students in foster care receive the affirmative care and inclusive support they deserve. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Phii Regis. Phii serves as the director of the All Children, All Families program at the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, where they lead efforts to promote LGBTQ plus inclusion in child welfare systems across the country. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Phii.
Thank you so much, Ben. I appreciate that. And hello to everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you all today. So as Ben mentioned, my name is Phii Regis. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the director for the All Children, All Families program. For anyone who's not familiar with the Human Rights Campaign, we're an LGBTQ plus civil rights advocacy organization, and All Children, All Families is the program at HRC that works with child welfare agencies to implement LGBTQ plus inclusive policies and practices, as well as to provide staff training as well. So what we'll be talking about today largely covers some of what we know to be the experiences of LGBTQ plus youth today. So every few years, HRC does a major survey of tens of thousands of LGBTQ plus youth around the United States. And we completed our most recent survey just last year. And this year we've been sharing the data that we found in that survey. So we'll be talking about that today in terms of what we know about LGBTQ plus youth experience in schools, their experiences with their mental health, how some of what we know is happening in the political landscape is impacting their mental health. And then we'll close with ways that all of us can show up to support LGBTQ plus youth. So without further ado, we'll dive right into the first section, which is school experiences. Right. So on this first slide here, what you're seeing is what we know about LGBTQ plus youth and their outness at school. It looks like, folks, is this a little bit better? Looks like my volume was a little bit low. Can folks hear me a little bit better now? Okay, perfect. So this is what we know about outness at school. So we've separated this between sexual orientation and gender identity. And one of the main items that I want to point out here is that while there are a relatively significant number of LGBTQ plus youth who may be out to their classmates, if we look at the percentages that are out to teachers and coaches, for example, that's still relatively low. So what resources, what education can we provide to teachers and coaches? What support can we provide to them to ensure that maybe they're showing up in a way that allows LGBTQ plus youth to perceive them as safe to come out to, right? Or how can we be the adults in their lives in these school environments that they are able to be out to and share their authentic self with? We know that less than 1 in 6 report that their folks in their school use their correct pronouns. And a little bit later in today's presentation, we'll show that there's a direct correlation between some of the negative mental health experiences that we've documented and the lack of the use of correct pronouns. We also see only 1 in 4 rather, are able to dress and express themselves in a way that matches their gender identity, right? 6 in 10 have been verbally or physically harassed at least once in the prior 30 school days, right? So we'll talk in more depth throughout today's session about how all of these experiences accumulate and have a negative mental health impact, and underscores the importance in us showing up for LGBTQ plus youth. So one positive sign, I suppose, is that over 70% of schools today have a gender sexuality alliance, right? But unfortunately, we still see very low percentages when it comes to LGBTQ plus inclusive sexual education and LGBTQ plus inclusive history curriculum, right? Which we know both are very important. We know that sexual health, you know, is largely impacted by the education that we receive. And when folks don't see themselves reflected in the education they're receiving, or don't see the way they show up with their partners reflected in that education, we're doing folks a disservice, right? And we need to ensure that we are connecting folks with those resources, because we know that in all likelihood they're not receiving these from their schools. Listen, folks may be familiar with that organization. They do have some great resources around inclusive sexual education and history curriculum. A little bit more about inclusive school resources. We also know that access to these inclusive school resources varies by geographic region. Specifically, we know that access is much lower in regions with worse policy environments for LGBTQ plus folks, right? So unfortunately, it's not as though, the areas where LGBTQ plus folks may feel under attack by policy, that they have more resources in those areas. In fact, it's the opposite. They have a lack of resources. So folks in the South, for example, we really need to provide the support, that they need at this moment. And we know many of us are not located in the South, right? So what can we do to put resources online that are accessible to folks in those areas who are not able to access those in schools? Here's what we know about LGBTQ plus youth and about their perceptions of their safety, right? So unfortunately, we see 46% of LGBTQ plus youth reported that they never or rarely felt safe in these different school environments, right? We've broken this down by bathrooms, locker rooms, and school bus, right? As you can see, the lack of safety is highest in locker rooms and bathrooms, right? And another thing that's important to point out here that you'll see reflected continuously in today's data is that the outcomes for trans and gender nonconforming young people tend to be worse, and they tend to face more bias, more discrimination, and more safety risks, right? And you can see that reflected in this data. A little bit more about what we know. Almost 20% reported that another student had hit or pushed them. Almost 50% reported that students made fun of them, and almost 60% reported any prior 30-day school bullying, right? Now, if we zoom out for a moment and think about each of these percentages as actual young people, right, who are vulnerable and need our support, again, this underscores the urgency in us showing up for LGBTQ plus youth, because if these are their experiences, we know that when the human brain in general, when it's focused on survival, we're not able to focus on some of our higher needs, right? And we want LGBTQ plus youth to be able to focus on school when they're in school, right? And when they're instead having to focus on their safety, we know that that creates significant challenges. We also know that states that have bathroom bans having a significant impact on our young people as well. As you can see, the majority surveyed indicated that they were not able to use a school bathroom in accordance with their gender identity, right? So now we're going beyond, mental health into, physical health as well, right? Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit from the survey for a bit to talk a bit more specifically about LGBTQ plus youth who have experiences in foster care and their experiences in schools. So 57% of youth in foster care are school aged, right? And as many of you on the line may be familiar with, we know that unfortunately they tend to attend multiple schools due to changes in placements, right? Studies show a high risk of dropping out of school or not graduating high school and lower rates of attending or graduating college, right? Now, when we think of that and we think about that in relation to what we know about LGBTQ plus youth, it really highlights how complex the challenges that these young people are facing are. And again, how important it is for us to show up. So we know LGB youth are up to 3 times more likely to experience harsh disciplinary treatment in schools. We also know that studies indicate these high rates of punishment do not correlate with higher rates of misbehavior, right? So what does that tell us? That tells us that bias and discrimination is playing a significant role in the punishment that is being prescribed to these LGBTQ plus youth. And we also know that there's significant distrust amongst LGBTQ plus youth of their school administrators. Now, another thing that's important to consider when we're talking about LGBTQ plus youth in foster care and their experiences in schools is how are their experiences in having multiple marginalized identities, how is that impacting how they're showing up in the world, right? Well, we know LGBTQ plus youth are already a vulnerable community, already navigating things like family rejection, which we know has a direct impact on all sorts of health outcomes. We just talked about bullying in school, for example, right? And then when we overlay that with the vulnerabilities of youth in foster care, we just talked about frequent school changes, lower graduation rates, lack of resources, right? LGBTQ plus youth in foster care, they're not experiencing these often in a separate, in a silo. It's often a compounded experience because they're navigating they're navigating the world in both of these systems at the same time, right? So how do we ensure that we are considering the full breadth of their experiences given the challenges that they may be having navigating the world with these multiple marginalized identities, right? Another way we can apply that intersectional lens is when we think about what we know about LGBTQ plus youth in foster care and the justice system, right? So that's what we have on the next slide here. We know that, as I mentioned, LGBTQ plus youth often experience multiple placements, right? Whether that's due to being rejected by a caregiver or struggling to find a kinship placement, et cetera, we know that they're more likely to experience multiple placements. Well, the data also shows that youth with more placements have a greater chance of entering the justice system, right? So again, we see how this intersectional lens is so important, because if we're considering, again, both of those experiences, we see that's a compounded vulnerability to entering the justice system, right? We also know LGBTQ plus youth are more likely to be placed in group homes, right? And in congregate care settings, right? And the data shows that youth placed in group homes are more likely to get involved in the justice system. Again, underscoring another vulnerability from navigating these systems. And we just talked a moment ago about how LGBTQ plus youth often face higher rates of disciplinary action in schools, right? Well, again, the data shows more disciplinary action. Well, that increases the likelihood of entering the justice system as well, right? So again, if we're thinking about how do we prevent these experiences, we have to use an intersectional lens. We have to think about their experiences navigating both of these marginalized identities. Okay. Now, those are a lot of challenges, a lot of things that underscore the urgency in us entering this work. But what do we do with this information, right? Or um, who can we advocate to that might be able to impact some of these outcomes? Well, some of us, in our roles may have varying capacity to engage in some of what you see on the slide here. So if it's not directly within the scope of your role to do some of these items, perhaps you at least know someone in the school who you can share this with who might be able to implement that, right? So for example, we know that visual cues of LGBTQ plus inclusion are very important to the LGBTQ plus community, right? Because we know, and we think about today's environment, especially for LGBTQ plus youth and the attacks that they're facing via state legislation, et cetera, we know that many of us have our guards up right now. And when we're entering environments, we don't know whether we're safe or not. So when we are able to provide visual cues that show LGBTQ plus youth that those who are, you know, in administration are committed to at least showing some level of LGBTQ plus affirmation, that can sometimes make that person more comfortable in that environment, right? And let them know that there is some level of support that they can expect. And that's important. Because again, we want to do what we can to ensure LGBTQ plus youth are not spending their hours in school focused on their safety or worrying about whether they'll have any support, because we know that distracts them from the classroom. So again, posting those visual cues, that's going to be a really important aspect of the advocacy that we can do in this area. If possible, ensuring the school has a process to address bias-based harassment and violence that explicitly protects LGBTQ plus people, right? It's important that when we think about policies, that we're advocating for policies with a very explicit inclusion of LGBTQ plus folks, right? Because that helps ensure that if folks are navigating some bias in leadership, et cetera, the more explicitly LGBTQ plus youth are included, the harder it is for folks to exclude them from those protections, right? So doing what we can to advocate for a bias-based harassment and violence policy that is explicitly inclusive of LGBTQ plus students is very important. And I will pause for a quick moment to highlight that, as I mentioned, the All Children, All Families program are housed within the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. And HRC actually has multiple programs that are charged with sort of improving the the safety and the living experiences of LGBTQ plus folks as it relates to multiple systems. And one of those is schools, right? So we have a welcoming schools program that provides curriculum that is LGBTQ plus inclusive, that provides all sorts of research-based strategies on how to prevent bias-based bullying, right? They don't do their work through the child welfare lens. They are, very specific to that education realm. But again, that's what this specific item here is referring to. So I did want to just take a moment to highlight the Welcoming Schools program at HRC, because that is an area where you can find resources that can help you address bias-based harassment and violence. All right. So back to the content here, it's also important that we're making space for our young people to share their experiences, right? Are we intentionally checking in with LGBTQ plus students about their experiences with harassment and violence in schools, right? Are we intentionally checking in about if we know they've experienced something and they had to report something, are we checking in with them before, during, after, right? How can we intentionally create that space in a mindful way that ensures LGBTQ plus youth feel like they have the space and the room to share challenges that they may be having? Because the more space that we create and the more we can ensure that's a safe space, that helps ensure that these young people can feel they can open up to you, right? And that helps you be able to provide the best support that you can. Another item to consider when it comes to advocacy is how you can push for LGBT plus inclusive practices in your school and professional development training on bias-based bullying for you and fellow educators. Again, this is an area where the Welcoming Schools program at HRC may be helpful for folks, and I'll be sure to drop the URL in the chat in a moment once I pause from the content. But that's another area where the Welcoming Schools program can be helpful, and that professional development training on bias-based bullying for you and fellow educators. So that's something important to keep in mind. And if you happen to be at a school where it doesn't exist, we talked about a few moments ago that over 70% already have it. But if you happen to be in an area where there is not a gender and sexuality alliance in your school, how can you create one or support the creation of one, right? These are all items that you all can consider in terms of how you can show up for LGBTQ plus youth to impact some of what we know to be their experiences in schools today. And again, depending on your role, not all of these may fall directly within your scope of influence, but in those cases, think about who you know who can have some level of impact in these areas, and perhaps that's where you can focus your advocacy. So I will pause here to see if there are any questions before we begin to shift into the next section of today's presentation. I'll give folks a moment. I know sometimes it takes a moment to think of the question we may have.
Hello, I do have a question.
Hi.
Hi. In light of the current political climate, and I don't know if maybe this fits better with the second half, but since we're talking about school systems, I thought I would bring the question here. I have a close friend who recently contacted her child's middle school after the recent election and asked the school to remove all indicators of her child's pronouns, gender identity, from school records because of fear of those items being on those school records. So I guess I am just interested in your perspective on that as a sound practice in these current political times. And also any insight into how schools can handle situations like that to protect their students while also affirming their identity.
Absolutely. And I'll say that's a nuanced area for sure, and something that, we could probably spend a whole session talking about, to be honest. And one thing I'll start out by sharing is our public education and research team is actually preparing to release a research report that really covers exactly what we're talking about here. What are the realities of collecting SOGI data in today's political environment? SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. What are the realities? What are the new, vulnerabilities, the new concerns, et cetera? And what are some of the strategies we might be able to implement to navigate those concerns, right? So that is a resource that is coming soon, and I can, be sure to connect Ben with that resource to disseminate to you all. But it's a very nuanced area, and a lot of it depends on your local area and the legislation that might be impacting where you are. So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer here, right? We do know that SOGI data is still very important, right? Because a lot, I can, especially for the work that All Children All Families does, I can say that a lot of our advocacy, we need that data, right? That's how we're able to show where, certain issues are and to speak to it, directly in that way. So there is still an importance in collecting that data. I think it's a matter of us having to be more diligent than ever in ensuring that we're considering all of the safety concerns and ensuring that we're going above and beyond to protect that data, right? And that we're consulting with our legal teams, et cetera, to really ensure we understand what we can be compelled to share, right? And what areas we might have absolute privacy on, right? So it's not a one size fits all answer here. It's too nuanced for that, unfortunately. But again, I can say that we are going to be releasing a report that dives into that in much more detail very soon. I hope that's helpful.
It is, thank you. And I'll watch for that information for sure.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have any questions before we move on? There'll be plenty of other opportunities to ask questions, but just wanted to pause before we moved on. All righty. So let's go ahead and move forward here. So in this next section, we're going to be connecting some of what we just talked about in terms of those challenging and negative experiences to how that's impacting mental health, right? And at the same time, we do want to make sure we are sort of sharing the full breadth of what we know to be these experiences. And we know they're not all negative, right? We do know that LGBTQ plus youth are also reporting a certain, elevated level of pride, if you will. And there is, hope for the future in that regard. So it's not all, sort of doom and gloom, if you will. So we'll talk through that in this section here. So what I want to point out here, I think, many of us on the call may already, know from plenty of other presentations that due to bias and discrimination, LGBTQ plus youth are LGBT plus folks in general often report, higher rates of depression, anxiety, and psychological distress, right? One thing I always, find very important to share whenever citing data like this is, these mental health outcomes like depression, anxiety, psychological distress, those aren't inherent to the LGBTQ plus community, right? Though the rates of the reporting of those experiences may be higher, it's not as though that's because someone is LGBTQ plus. Rather, it's because of the bias and discrimination that they face as a result of that identity, right? So sometimes that correlation can get a little muddied, if you will. So I just want to make sure that, I'm being intentional about clarifying that that's the result of bias and discrimination as opposed to, something that's inherent to the identity itself, right? And then another thing I want to highlight here, and we talked about this a little bit earlier as well, the outcomes for trans and gender nonconforming folks are often worse, unfortunately, due to, continued discrimination and lack of understanding of the trans and gender expansive community in general, right? So that's what we see reflected here as well. Higher rates of depression and anxiety than their LGBTQ plus counterparts, right? So that may underscore, the importance for, maybe you identifying other trainings or resources that really do a deep dive on how to support trans and gender expansive folks specifically. I know All Children All Families has a number of items like that. HRC in general has a number of items like that. So I think that's what is an important takeaway from this slide. Now, what do we know about LGBTQ plus youth and their experience with therapy and accessing therapy? Well, there is somewhat promising, data showing that, at least, 50% or 53% receive therapy in the past year. However, we still are seeing 41% with unmet therapy needs. You know, that's almost half. And that's given what we know to be the negative experiences, especially in today's environment. We know that this is all impacting mental health. So if folks are not having those needs met in therapy, how can we connect them with mental health providers? How can we connect them with other forms of mental health treatment that they might find more effective, or that might resonate with them more directly, or might be more accessible even, right? That's really important to consider. And, you know, one thing that I personally have found really helpful in this area is the online support communities for LGBTQ plus folks. Oftentimes one of the beauties, I think, of online support groups, especially for LGBTQ plus folks, is you can often find very nuanced sort of groups that are have sort of an affinity focus, where folks can see their identities more directly reflected, because many of these groups are not necessarily focused on they may not only be focused on the entire LGBTQ plus community. You may be able to find some that are specific to trans folks or specific to Black trans folks, et cetera. And that can be some of the beauty in online support groups, is that they're able to have that level of specificity when it comes to identity that might help some folks who might not see themselves reflected in other forms of mental health treatment. So that's something to consider here as well. A little bit more about experiences in therapy. You know, it is good to see that LGBTQ plus youth are reporting, for the most part, that therapists are somewhat or very informed, right? But there's clearly still room to go, right? We ideally, you know, want LGBTQ plus youth to all feel that their therapists are very informed, right? And we definitely don't want, you know, almost 22% to feel that they're not at all or not very informed, right? So how can we ensure that if we're connecting a young person to a therapist or a mental health provider, that we are doing our due diligence to vet them and ensure that they have some level of LGBTQ plus information, right? And what tools or information can we provide to our young people so that they're equipped to ask therapists the questions they need to assess that for themselves as well, because we want to empower young people to determine that for themselves as well. Something I talked a little bit about earlier, we see a direct correlation between misgendering and negative mental health outcomes. So we asked LGBTQ plus youth, how often do others call you by the pronouns you want them to use at home, right? And you can see here, those who indicated that they never had the correct pronouns used, that's where we see the highest rates of anxiety and depression, right? We'll talk a little bit more in the next section about best practices when it comes to pronoun use and how we can support those who may use a pronoun outside of the gender binary, or may use a pronoun outside of their sex assigned at birth as well. We see similar results when we look at misgendering in schools as well, right? So again, very important that we are equipped with the information that we need to ensure that we're following best practices when supporting the use of pronouns for our LGBTQ plus youth. So what we have here is a quote from a parent of a 5-year-old non-binary child in Massachusetts. And here's what I'll read that for you here. Every anti-trans message, particularly anti-trans girls in sports message, hits close to home and makes me scared for their future. Will they be physically or emotionally harmed? Will society's lack of acceptance of their identity make them a target of hate crimes? What will acceptance look like as they grow up, go through puberty? Will they be able to play the sports they want safely? Will they be able to be themselves all the time? They already make others more comfortable than themselves when they feel social pressure to allow others to misgender them without correction. It is exhausting to constantly correct people and teach them what non-binary means, especially when you're a 5-year-old who already thought more about gender than most adults, right? So there are a few things that I think are important to pull out from here, right? One, we see clearly, as this parent shares the experience, that these messages, this anti-trans rhetoric, it is having a direct impact on folks, right? And we see that it's causing folks to fear for their physical or emotional safety, et cetera, right? So it's clearly having a direct impact, right? And then we're also seeing one of the reasons why it's so important that you all continue to do what you're doing today, right? Which is continuing to empower yourself and equip yourself with information on how to serve the LGBTQ plus community, because we know, unfortunately, too many times young people feel that burden of responsibility on themselves when we don't want it to be that way, right? We don't want a 5-year-old to feel burdened with the need to correct people about how to address them authentically, right? That's not the world that we want. So again, how can we continue to do what you're doing today and equipping yourself with the information to ensure that you're empowered with what you need to know, and that you can maybe even equip your colleagues around you with the information they may need as well. Here's a quote from a parent of a 10-year-old transgender girl. I am most concerned about the state we live in, Montana, and the continued legislative threats to her safety and well-being. We have considered leaving Montana, a state I grew up in and a state we had planned to raise our children in, because of these continued threats. I want what any parent wants. I want my kids to grow up to be healthy, to be happy and healthy. The current landscape is making that dream much harder to envision, right? And, we know this to be the reality of too many families around the country right now, especially those who are in areas with anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. We know there are many families who are being forced to move from states where, multiple generations of their family have resided, just to try to ensure some level of safety for their young people, right? So this is the environment, unfortunately, that we are in today. And again, underscores the importance of doing exactly what you're doing today and equipping yourself with the information needed to help combat this. So this is what we see when it comes switching gears a bit, right? As I mentioned, I want to make sure we're sort of covering the full breadth of the experience. So we're switching gears a little bit to talk about hopes and also some concerns for the future. Well, I think it's really positive to see that 81% want to attend college. That means 81% of the LGBTQ plus youth that we surveyed indicated that they wanted to attend college. I think that's huge, right? At the same time, almost 30% indicated they're afraid that their LGBTQ plus identity will negatively impact future higher education opportunities, right? And one thing I'll pause to share on this, something that always stuck with me from one of our prior surveys. As I mentioned, we do these surveys of LGBTQ plus youth every 4 years. And the survey we did prior to this one, something that always stuck with me is when we asked LGBTQ plus youth what their most important concerns are right now, and we compared that with non-LGBTQ plus youth, what we found was that non-LGBTQ plus youth were focused on their future and focused on higher education and focused on job opportunities, et cetera, whereas more LGBTQ plus youth were focused on their safety and their immediate well-being, right? And I think that speaks to what you're seeing here in terms of that fear of that identity negatively impacting future higher ed opportunities, right? A little bit more, almost 77% indicated that they want to be open about their LGBTQ plus identity at a future job, right? At the same time, 70% fear they'll be discriminated against at work due to their SOGI. 54% will be able to think they'll be able to authentically express themselves when applying for jobs. 43% believe their LGBTQ plus identity will negatively impact their future career, right? So we see some, causes for, encouragement, if you will, in terms of not improved necessarily, but in terms of hopes and perceptions of the future. But then we see that, they are still navigating these complex fears at the same time. So we also know that of the LGBTQ plus youth surveyed, more than half indicated that they somewhat or strongly agree that the LGBTQ plus community is accepted more and more every day, right? So again, we are seeing some, hopes and some indications of positivity. And 90% are proud to be part of the LGBTQ plus community, right? That means 90% of the LGBTQ plus youth that we surveyed here indicated they were proud to be part of the community, despite, all of the legislation, despite all of the continued violence against the trans community, still proud to be part of the community. At the same time, they have also indicated, 23% indicated that they wish they were not LGBTQ plus. 34% indicated they feel depressed when they think a lot about being LGBTQ plus. And almost 44% feel critical about themselves when they think about being LGBTQ plus, right? So again, we're seeing, perhaps some signs of that progress, but then also seeing indications of the impact of what's going on in today's climate as well. Now, with all of that information, what do we do with that? Well, we connect our local schools and youth serving organizations with information about LGBTQ plus affirming services, right? And help reduce the stigma of seeking counseling. HRC partners with organizations like Mental Health America and the Trevor Project, for example, that have some great resources when it comes to supporting the mental health needs of LGBTQ plus youth. So you can consider looking at both of those organizations for resources to connect your local schools with, right? Again, we saw that the outcomes for trans and gender nonconforming youth when it came to mental health were worse. So how are we advocating for policies and practices that can encourage trans and gender nonconforming folks and gender expansive folks to be their full authentic selves in counseling sessions without fear of being outed, and ensuring, to the point of Lina earlier, that their pronouns are kept confidential. Another thing to consider is we are also seeing some shifts in terms of the norms, if you will, around coming out. There are more and more young people who don't feel the pressure necessarily to come out to everyone. And some folks prefer to let other people in, meaning they choose who they feel is entitled to know their authentic self, and they don't feel that same pressure when it comes to needing everyone to know, for example, right? Others don't feel that they ever need to announce it, right? That they may be LGBTQ plus, but they don't ever need to necessarily have that sit down conversation with you, right? And, some of what we may, still see on TV, but especially saw a few years ago, right? We're starting to see some trends from shifting away from that. So recognizing that the needs around coming out might look different than what we anticipated a few years ago. And, how we navigate that and what we, may encourage young people to consider when it comes to that, it's important to keep that in mind, right? Now, as I mentioned, the data that we've covered today comes from our most recent survey on LGBTQ plus youth. We've done several reports sharing this data out. And we've released several sub-reports as well, where we, do a closer look at some of the more vulnerable communities within the LGBTQ plus community and focusing on that specifically. So, for example, this past February, we released the 2024 Black LGBTQ plus youth report, right? And then we've also released a disabled LGBTQ plus youth report, right? So plenty of opportunities for ongoing learning for you, with information that is specific to, that does a deeper dive on some of the more vulnerable communities represented within LGBTQ plus youth. With that, I will pause again before we enter our last section here, to see what questions folks may have. And we'll have another moment at the end of the presentation for questions as well, but just want to pause again to see if folks have anything top of mind at the moment. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. Again, we'll leave some time at the end for questions. I'm going to share a short video that just speaks to the impact it can have when we support LGBTQ plus youth. Bear with me just one moment while I get that shared.
He like does my hair, does all of that stuff.
You're not wearing that.
I'm not wearing that. Are you?
I'm gonna pick it out.
I have fun with him, you know?
Foster kids, they move home to home to home, and I hated it with a passion.
Because, you know, his personality was more like a little sad thing because he had a foster home that they were very abusive to him.
You know, at first I thought I was gonna move homes again with her, but it was never gonna happen. And she told me, you're here forever until, you're on your own.
Well, when he came out to me, I wanted to let him know it's not a big deal. You know, this is who you are, this is how you were born, and you're free to love and be happy with whoever you want to be with. And so when he came out to me, the first thing I was like, duh.
I didn't know she was gonna say it like that, but shoot. Well, I feel really special to have that closeness and safetyness with her, and she's gone through so much with me that I feel like I have that bond, strong bond with her.
Be there for them, like you're gonna be there for your own child. He's now in my care, and I'm gonna make sure that, whatever he comes out to be in life is gonna be something that he wants. I want to build his confidence.
And she has, trust me, she has. She made a difference in my life. And she's a vulnerable person. She made me who I am.
How do you know you won't make a difference until you try? You have to try.
Well, thank you all for taking a moment to watch that. It's one of my favorite videos because I think it does a really stellar job at highlighting how deep of an impact one person can have on a young person who is navigating challenges with their LGBTQ plus identity, right? We saw the young person and the way they looked at, their caregiver with such, pride and appreciation, just for showing up for them and being affirming for them. And we know from reports like that, like one from the Trevor Project, that shows that one person who is affirming in an LGBTQ plus youth's life can make all of the difference between, them potentially attempting suicide, right? So just having one affirming adult can potentially save an LGBTQ plus youth's life. And we saw that in this video here as well. All right. So switching gears a little bit to talk through how we can support LGBTQ plus youth. Well, this is an example of how someone supported an LGBTQ plus youth from the perspective of the young person. My old old caseworker changed his subject the one time I tried to let on I was a lesbian. After that, he treated me differently too, like there was a cold wind blowing in the room. Then I got transferred to my new caseworker. The minute I walked into her office, I knew things were going to be better. She had this poster about gay people over her desk and some rainbow beads hanging on her lamp. It was okay to tell her who I am, right? So this is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, about the deep impact it can have when there are visual cues of inclusion that a young person can see, and how that can affirm for them that things are going to be okay, and might even encourage them to share their authentic selves with you. Now, these are some behaviors that do not convey a welcoming environment. These are the items we want to avoid, right? We want to avoid forms of overt and covert hostility. We want to avoid well-meaning but off-putting language. And we want to also avoid omissions or silence. You know, sometimes if we're not fully comfortable perhaps around someone's identity, we might, just try to, bypass that and ignore it, right? Those are all behaviors that do not convey a welcoming environment. Let's dive into that a little bit more. If you're wondering what are some examples of overt hostility to avoid, that's essentially any form of obvious homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, right? That includes refusing to use someone's chosen name or pronouns, right? That's a form of overt hostility. There's also covert hostility, such as preferential treatment for straight or cis youth, or double standards for LGBTQ plus youth, right? Here's an example of what that double standard can look like. Everyone was allowed to have their boyfriends over, but whenever I asked to have my girlfriend over, they would tell me that depended on whether she was coming as a friend or a girlfriend. On the opposite end, on my first day, my caseworker told my foster parents that I had a girlfriend and that I wanted to keep seeing her if that was possible. They said that they would make sure that happened. I knew that I wasn't going anywhere for a long time, right? So we see in this first example how covert hostility showed up, and we see what the opposite can look like as well. When it comes to well-meaning or off-putting language, that's usually language that might still have some, level of heterocentrism or more cissexism in it, right? So if we assume that based on someone's gender, if we assume the gender of who their romantic partner might be, that is an example of language we want to avoid, right? So instead of saying something like, do you have a boyfriend or husband? Instead, you would want to say, are you dating or seeing anyone? Do you have a partner or co-parent, right? We never want to assume the gender of who someone may be attracted to or have a relationship with, right? We also want to be mindful that sometimes other forms of language that we use might inadvertently enforce the gender binary as well, right? Many of us have been, raised to use words like ladies, gentlemen, ma'am, sir, right? Well, when we're addressing a group and we don't know everyone's gender, that might actually be very off-putting or exclusionary, right? For me, example, as a non-binary person, if I'm in a room when someone says ladies and gentlemen, I automatically don't feel that I'm reflected in that, and I feel excluded, right? Now, that doesn't mean you can never use these words, right? If you are sitting in front of a few people and you happen to know, they've already disclosed their gender to you, and you know confidently, how they identify, then perhaps some of these binary terms might still be applicable, right? It doesn't mean you can never use it, but it's just examples. It's just for situations when you don't know everyone's identity. And then you can instead use things like friends or folks or everyone, right? Other forms of best practice language to keep in mind, right? This is an example of language you want to avoid. You never want to say something like, he's a boy, but he feels like a girl, right? That's not affirming at all. Instead, you would say, she's a girl who was assigned male at birth, right? You never want to use someone's incorrect pronouns to explain their identity, right? And the best way to describe the way someone was assigned, their sex assigned at birth, is to say it just as you see here, assigned male at birth, right? Some other examples of best practices with language. I mentioned this earlier, we were going to talk about pronoun etiquette. You always want to use someone's chosen name and pronouns unless they've asked for you not to, right? And if you don't know, you want to ask, essentially. Avoid using pronouns for someone if you don't know them and just use their name. Now, it's also important to know that we're all human, right? And sometimes we make mistakes. So if that happens, you want to apologize and move on quickly. You don't want to belabor the moment and extend that discomfort for the other person. You don't want to center yourself by belaboring the point, right? So apologize quickly and move on. And ensure you're gently correcting others who misgender other people, right? Call them in rather than calling them. Lastly, as we begin to wrap up here, a few things to also consider are that tone and body language matter, right? So you have a PDF of this slide deck. You can always reference this to consider some of the nonverbal forms of communications that can still be perceived as off-putting, right? So you want to avoid things like fidgeting, tapping, lack of acknowledgement, etc. And keep in mind, there's a difference between being tolerating and welcoming, right? When you're tolerating someone, you're assuming there's something wrong that needs to be tolerated, whereas when you're welcoming, you're assuming they're fine just the way they are. Here are some examples of the welcoming images that you can consider using. These are some of the examples of visual cues that you can consider. Now, when it comes to these welcoming images, they should reflect the full diversity of the LGBTQ plus community, right? As you see in the quote here, rainbows are often not enough because they miss the trans part, right? Not all trans folks see themselves reflected in a rainbow or something that says love is love, right? So consider the full diversity of the community. And we're right at time here, so I do want to make sure we're pausing for any last questions. But again, you have a PDF of the slide deck, and you can take a look at some of the organizational strategies that you can consider advocating for to leadership. Again, you have a PDF of the slide deck, so you can always consider that or reach out to our team for more information. So I appreciate you all. Again, it's more important than ever that we're doing what we can to be supportive of LGBTQ plus youth. For those who may have to hop, I understand, but otherwise I'm here to answer any questions that folks may have. In case folks are still thinking of any questions, I'll just say again, HRC has been around since the 1980s, and this is the first time in our 40-year history last year that we declared a state of emergency for the LGBTQ plus community, right? So again, it really is more important than ever. I can't thank you enough for spending the time to learn more about how you can support the LGBTQ plus community during this continued moment of crisis. So my deep gratitude to you all.
And on behalf of everyone in attendance, as we wait for any lingering questions, I want to thank you all for being here. Just a friendly reminder, I dropped that evaluation in the chat. Not only is that imperative for continuing education credits, but it's helpful to us and Phii to understand what we can further develop, especially around this critical issue. So thank you all for being here today. We will send that follow-up email with the attachments. And if you ever need anything, please reach out to us at pafostercare.org and pafostercare@csc.csiu.org. And of course, reach out to Phii at HRC. But thank you again, Phii. We really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks again to you all. Appreciate your time.